What's up, everyone, and welcome back. I'm your host, Markayle Tolliver, and you're listening to Momentum with Markayle. We're so excited and happy to share and launch our podcast with you. Be sure to follow my YouTube page as well as all of my socials to keep up with all of our contact. Today, I have the honor and privilege of hosting the Executive Director of Urban Alliance Chicago with me, which is Chris. What's your last name?
Chrislin Flanagan.
Chrislin Flanagan, which is an organization that provides Chicago high school seniors with internships throughout the city of Chicago. Thank you again, Chris, for joining us. We'll start with the introduction of yourself and a little bit about yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Markayle. Such a pleasure to be here this evening. As you noted, I'm Chrislin Flanagan, Executive Director for Urban Alliance Chicago, which is a national youth nonprofit. I have been with the organization for a little over a year and a half, daughter of Chicago, and excited to share my story.
Sounds good. Daughter of Chicago. I'm a son of Chicago. Tell us a little bit about your birth and your coming up here in Chicago and how that impacted you.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, daughter of Chicago, but grew up on the South Side, primarily in the Inglewood community. My father's family is from the Roseland community, so kind of spent time between both. Went to Hyde Park for high school many moons ago, Chicago State for undergraduate, and then Roosevelt for graduate school. But as a younger child, growing up in the Inglewood community, I'm the middle daughter of an older brother and a younger sister. And so I found myself often being the little big sister, like to think or deem myself as a scholar. So I was often in a lot of gifted programs. And I would just look at my surroundings, Markayle, and honestly know that one day I wanted to make a difference. On my mother's side of the family, my maternal grandmother had 12 children. So I have 6 uncles and 5 aunties. And despite having a really big family, one of the things that I wholeheartedly remember from my childhood is that there was never a mouth that my grandmother wouldn't feed. And so I started to really take, keen to the resources that was around the community that I was in, and often would look and see, despite, having lack of resources, the community and being there for one another. And so, watching my grandmother always cook a pot of beans and feed everybody on the block, became heartwarming to me. Watching my mother buy us clothes from the thrift store and then share those hand-me-downs with other families that was in need. It showed me that despite having a little, that there was still impact to be made. And then once I got into high school, at Hyde Park Career Academy, did very well academically. And then during my senior year, to my surprise, I became pregnant with my oldest son. And I remember, i.e., disappointing so many people that, said, oh, my God, you threw your life away. And then those were those few that said, despite this, keep going, keep pushing. And I had, some cheerleaders continually telling me to keep moving forward. And those are the moments that I hold close to my heart. And so from there, unfortunately, I didn't go away to school and on my traditional plan. But nevertheless, I went to, Kennedy King and received my associate's degree. I got a job, and then from there went to Chicago State and then went to Roosevelt. And so thus that just kind of grew my love for community. It grew my love for purpose. It grew my love for not writing anyone off. And so that's where my hard work, kind of came into play. And after navigating through a few different careers, I worked in education for a Department of Education for a number of years. I've worked in banking and finance. I've worked in fintech and onboarding, and had the pleasure of being able to travel throughout different parts of the world. And finally, I found myself, despite the role that I was in, always giving back to community. So my family and I would host food giveaways. We would always volunteer to, feed those at the shelters. And so I had an opportunity to start working at Roseland Community Hospital on the far South Side, a community that lacks resources. It's almost a food desert, if you will. And, I started off in Roseland in the HR department, which is, my background. And shortly after that, was kind of tapped by administration and said, hey, our hospital's foundation have been stagnant for a few years. We would like for you to oversee it. And so I did. And so I was able to successfully take that hospital foundation that had been stagnant, i.e. not, hosting any events for the community, not receiving adequate funding, and not really understanding, the resources resource that was in the community. And so thus I became the executive director for the hospital's foundation and held a dual role as the marketing and community relations director.
Wow. Impactful story, impactful upbringing. And as you were talking, some things kind of fell on my heart and kind of fell in my mind, that a lot of African Americans go through a lot of the same issues. Me being one of three on my father's side, I'm the middle, so I was the big little brother, kind of in your instances as well. Also, you talked a little bit about seeing disparities and seeing lack in your community. Talk a little bit more about that, because that's something that I see a lot, and that has driven me to where I'm at today.
Absolutely. So I'll actually share, a personal story. So I was at Roseland Community Hospital for about 4 years, but in the thick of the pandemic, working out with my 2 teenage children, was at the gym one day and actually collapsed.
Wow.
And, during that collapse, it was very shocking. It was very sudden, but I got up and I put on my what we like to call the black woman cape, and I put on my black woman cape, told everybody I was fine, went home and took a bath and had a ginger ale. And I woke up the next morning and my body said, no, you're not okay. And so thus, I went to the hospital and they ran some tests and they told me you should probably see a cardiologist. Long story short, I was diagnosed with aortic valve regurgitation, which essentially meant that my aortic valve had collapsed. And blood was not flowing through my body, and I needed to have surgery. And, to my surprise, I was asked to see a cardiac surgeon. And so, they started to ask me if I had a support person I can call in and, all of these different things. I really did not understand what was happening at the time. Cardiac health is very prevalent in my family. And so, my mother has, heart issues and has a stent. And, I was attributing that condition to that. Well, to my surprise, I actually needed to have open heart surgery. And so at this time, I was 41 years old. My children were, very young adults. And I had always said, open heart surgery, that's for old people, right? And so they said, no, it's for people that have an aortic valve that has collapsed. And so that was a very difficult transition for my family as we got ready to navigate that. One, because it was so sudden, it was very onset, and the immediate remedy for that was open heart surgery. And I remember several visits to the University of Chicago. And so, mind you, I was working at a hospital, but I was receiving my care at the University of Chicago. So we talk about disparities. That was one of the very first disparities. The fact that I'm working at a hospital, but they don't have the resources to be able to fix my condition. So thus, I'm sent into a different neighborhood, into a different community, into a different healthcare system, and the hospital within my own community, again, lacked those resources. And so after several visits back and forth with cardiology and radiology and getting all of these tests to prepare, I noticed that the University of Chicago had a food pantry, and I, would attribute that back to being at Roseland Community Hospital, where, again, a food desert. The closest grocery store is Walmart. And, I immediately said, wow, there's a food pantry where folks can literally come in and receive free items for anything that they needed. And so it immediately sparked that little girl in Inglewood from me, and watching my grandmother feed the block, or my mother give clothing, or sharing resources with the families on the block, because that's how we built community. We essentially had to be each other's village. And so I went back to my team, and I wanted to be able to determine, what can I do? I think sometimes we look for other folks to be the solution to our problems, and I wanted to be the solution to that problem. And so, being the director of community relations, people would call the hospital all the time and ask if we had a diaper program, or if we had, milk that we can give their babies, or, if they can get a voucher because they was visiting a family member and didn't have food. And so I went to my administration and I said, hey, this exists at the University of Chicago. I would like to bring this to Roseland.
So name some of those programs that were brought to Roseland from you talking to your administration and leadership.
Absolutely. So the very first thing that we did was we opened a free community pantry. And it wasn't just a regular free community pantry. I wholeheartedly believe that when we bring resources to the community, we need to make sure that they don't have barriers. And if you know, like I know, most food pantries have restrictive hours, or you have to live within the zip code, and all of those things. And I wanted it to be a very low lift. I wanted to remove as much red tape as we can. And so we opened this free 24-hour pantry because the hospital's open 24 hours, so why can't the pantry be open? And so we removed all of the restrictions, and I told them, if we're going to do this, let's make sure that there's no barriers. And so the first was making sure that it was accessible 24 hours per day. The second was making sure that some of the items that the community was asking for were present there. So it was more than just non-perishable foods, but it was diapers, it was sanitary products, all of those things that we kind of take for granted, but folks are being able to use. We also made sure that we just had, partnered with different organizations for not just food giveaways, but healthy food giveaways. And I think that that's important, in our communities. And then there were some of the events that were just kind of consistent and held year after year. Back to school drive, making sure that young people had adequate supplies to be able to navigate the school system, or uniforms during the holidays, making sure that, folks had turkey giveaways and things like that. The hospital also had a Christmas program. And one of the things that I wanted to do, again, in thinking about removing that red tape, removing barriers, right? And so oftentimes with those Christmas giveaways, families come up and they're ultimately tasked with being able to choose an item that's available. And again, in the spirit of intentionality, I changed that setting. And what we started to do was have families register and provide wish lists. And so that way we know that when Chrislin came up, or when Markayle came up, and this was, 14-year-old Chrislin and 8-year-old Markayle, that there was a gift that was appropriate for them. And so that was the goal, to make sure that there was intentionality, in those programs.
I love that. Now, to obviously observe the elephant in the room, how did you combat that, or get over the hurdles with people that weren't like you in terms of race, in terms of gender, and in terms of actually going along with that idea? There were some that probably said, no, let's put this food pantry only for 2 hours, 3 hours. How did you hurdle over the roadblocks?
Absolutely. I think, again, for me, hurdling those roadblocks was taking the initiative. Again, I think sometimes we sit in spaces and we wait for the savior, and I wholeheartedly believe in doing the work myself. And so thus, in the beginning, I was the person that was stocking the pantry. I was the person that was tapping into my network and saying, okay, hey, we're running low. Can we get more supplies? And unfortunately, some things become like catch fire, right? Like people have to see it being successful in order to catch on. And so that was my goal. If I can prove that there's a success, if I can prove that there's a need. And so again, very intentional about every element. So there was a sign-up sheet, but it wasn't a sign-up sheet to capture data. It was a sign-up sheet to capture need. And so thus I can go back and say, we have X amount of people using this pantry, this amount, is this demographic. And so showing that need, that also helped with some of the buy-in. But yes, you're absolutely right. There were a bunch of naysayers. There were a bunch of, oh, this isn't going to work. It's going to be temporary. And just really having those very forward and transparent conversations, we're certainly instrumental in that.
Yes. And so now a lot of your upbringing, a lot of what you've been through in life have kind of shifted and trajected you to where you're at now. So talk a little bit about the work that you do, who you impact, the program that you run. Talk a little bit more about Urban Alliance.
Absolutely. I certainly will. So I am a mother of 3. So my oldest son is now 25 years old. I have a daughter that's 20 years old, and my youngest son is 18. My daughter, who is 20 years old, went to Kenwood High School. And during the time that I was working at Roseland, she was a senior in student government, and she was actually a participant of Urban Alliance. And so one night we were on a parent meeting, and the then executive director had a call to action. They said, hey, we're a youth workforce development organization. There's no other people to support our young people than the parents. So parents, where do you work? And so naturally, the giver in me, the, impactful upbringing, I chimed in and said, well, hey, I work at, Roseland Community Hospital. What does
Yeah.
this look like? And of course, she immediately set up a meeting the following day to discuss the program a little bit more. So I knew it from the parental lens and seeing the benefit of my daughter receiving these workforce development courses and having access to an internship. But this kind of shifted that trajectory a little bit and said, how can you now enter into a different space? And so thankfully, I was one of the people that had a seat at the table. So just like the food pantry, I took this initiative to administration and said, hey, we have a lot of black and brown babies in our community that desire to work in a healthcare pathway. What place better to get that experience than a hospital in their community?
Yes.
And so the hospital administration ultimately agreed. That year we started to host 10 young people in various parts of the hospital. What I appreciated was that we were able to expand that to not just be, I think when folks see healthcare, they think doctor or nurse, right? But there are so many different pathways within that hospital. And so those 10 young people got to work in IT, they got to work in surgery, they got to work in marketing, medical records. And so I was very, very thankful for that experience. I was thankful that I got to lead that. And so that was my first introduction to Urban Alliance. Moving forward, I like to tell folks that I now have 3 Urban Alliance eyes, that of a parent, that of a job partner, and now as executive director. And so I fast forwarded just a little bit there, but our executive director for Chicago was promoted to CEO. So she uprooted her family to DC, and she kind of tapped back and said, hey, this opportunity is available. Have you seen it? I think that maybe you should consider applying. I did. And, I absolutely love it here because I get to see, all of the little Chrislins of the world and all of the little individual people that they are, and just remind them that there's hope, that there's purpose. And so thus my advocacy for them, is much more than checking a box. It's really intentional. It's really purposeful.
I really, really am inspired by that, being an African-American student myself from the Chicagoland area and going through different schools in Chicago. And specifically, you talked about allowing students to see outside the regular tradition job, which is definitely something I've been talking to my siblings and mentees about because, again, we give our children this lane, this degree. You have to go into this lane. You have to get this degree. If you want to be a lawyer, you have to go through here. But there are other avenues. There are other jobs in these fields, in these industries that our children can actually prosper and grow in. What was the biggest lesson you learned from your work?
I think the biggest lesson that I've learned is that the young people voice matter.
Yes.
It does a disservice to me when I see the news stories, when I see the narratives being painted that says, we got kids downtown jumping on cars and they're, running amok, and I don't negate that some of those things are happening, but it's not our story. Our story, our reality is that year after year, programs like Urban Alliance receive upwards of 400 or 500 applications of students saying, hey, I want a job. I want professional development skills. I want to do better. And then barriers like funding, like job partners, become the conduit that does not allow those things to come full circle. And so that's always a point of contention for me when I'm having conversations or when I'm seeing the news. And it's like, all of these kids are doing these things and I'm in my executive director bucket and my team has 400 applications and we know that next year we only have a spot for 125.
Wow. So how many of those children and youth now have nothing, now have to resort to going downtown, doing crimes, in their neighborhoods doing crime? Wow, very impactful. And with that, what is your call to action or your advice to people in those positions, elected officials, police officers, state and citywide, that literally can help with crime and with youth development?
Absolutely. So I have 2 call to actions. Unfortunately, the nonprofit work, there is a profit in it. The profit in it is our young people. The profit in it is our young people that are going to be our next doctors and lawyers and CPAs and recording artists and all of those things. And if we don't make the investment today, we will pay tomorrow. The other unfortunate reality that I see is that a lot of folks unfortunately view nonprofit work as a hand out instead of a hand up. And so we have to change that narrative. And I go back to what I said earlier. There's no one coming to save us. We are the solution. And so my call to action is, let's not sit on the sideline and clap. Let's not sit on the sideline and cheer and say, wow, that team is doing great, but become part of the solution. I.e., if you have a business, open up your business and take on an intern.
Yes.
Be a mentor. If there is federal funding, allot that funding so that most of our actions can be proactive and not reactive.
Absolutely.
I would much rather see those dollars being allocated to workforce development programs than programs designed from the pipeline to keep them out of prison.
Yep.
Or re-entering them into society because they didn't have these opportunities. And so somewhere along the way, I believe that narrative has shifted where folks believe it takes this big thing to do. And I continuously prove time after time that small efforts from little individuals can be truly impactful.
Indeed. It's Women's History Month, and definitely wanted to touch on that a little bit. What women have inspired you through your journey, both professionally and or personally?
Absolutely. And so personally, it will have to be my 8th grade teacher. So my 8th grade teacher is Dr. Angelia Roberts Watkins, and she was more than an educator. She was part of our village, and she became so much part of my village that she's attended my baby shower. Wow. She's attended my wedding. She's attended my college graduations. And it was educators like that proved I'm not coming here to get a job. I'm coming here to make sure that I have left the world in a better place than I found it. And so I always have to pay homage to her because she's proven time after time again who she is, not just on paper, but in person and in real life. And, celebrity-wise, I would have to say Rosa Parks. So I say Rosa Parks for a few reasons. One, we share the same birthday, so it's the Aquarius in me. But also, I just think just the tenacity, right? It sometimes is very difficult to take a stance when everybody is doing the same thing. And, oftentimes we're challenged to just say, no.
Yep. Yes.
Just no. Sometimes that simple no can be truly impactful. And look what Rosa Parks, no, I am not moving, not today.
Yeah.
Changed the entire trajectory of the civil rights movement. And so she would have to be my historical figure person.
Sounds good. I like that. And you mentioned taking a stand in our current political climate in our city and in our country. That's definitely where African Americans and those that are marginalized need to understand and step up, that it's time for us to come together. It's time for us to stand up one with another and work together and collaborate and support each other. So definitely thank you for mentioning that. What legacy or impact do you hope your work will leave for future generations?
I think more than anything, I want to bring back the spirit of community. And so, again, I remember, my childhood address was 5644 South Green. Our block was the community. There wasn't a family that didn't have because we were the community. So when a family didn't have enough for the store, borrowing from a neighbor was commonplace. And that was in any capacity. And so I would like to see us move away from these silos that we've created and just get back to community.
How can we do that? How can we, as Black people, as organizations, as leaders, how can we begin to do that and kind of bring people back together?
Absolutely. I think it's the small steps. I think it's, again, an organization may not have the capacity to host a young person, but can you be a mentor? Can you volunteer? So I think it's leaning in and gleaning into the internal things that we already have and using those things to make some type of difference. I wholeheartedly believe, Markayle, that each of us have a unique trait that we can offer someone else.
Yep. A mentor told me everyone has their own story, and I believe that. Everyone specifically has their own purpose, their own story, their own book within inside of them. And it's just, again, the matter of being represented, having that mentor, having that shoulder to lean on, to cry on, so that we could, in times of trouble, be able to regroup and recalibrate ourselves and grow from that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, there's small steps. You know, somebody might see Urban Alliance as, oh gosh, there's a fee to host an intern, and but there are so many different programmatic elements. You know, one of the benefits of our program is that every Friday the students have professional development workshop while they're in their skills. You know, say, hey, Urban Alliance, you know, can I drop off a box of granola bars?
Yes.
You know, can I bring a bag of apples so that the students can be replenished, can be refreshed? You know, I took this HR course and I learned the power of resume writing. Can I volunteer to run a session?
Correct.
Right. And so there's so many different ways that we can lean in.
Sounds good. Yep. Two more questions. A little bit about looking into our future. If you could change one thing about your industry, what would it be? You touched on a little bit about the nonprofit work and tapping in with a lot of our elected officials to help. But what else? What is one thing or something else that you would change about your industry?
I would just say funding as a whole. And I know that I tapped into that a little bit, but, you know, elaborating on that a little bit more. I love the nonprofit space. We have folks in nonprofit right now from literally infancy to, you know, to our seniors. And thus that landscape has become very difficult to navigate because, you know, the guarantors are now struggling to determine what work they will support. And so I would like to see more federal dollars, more national dollars, you know, allocated to the work that we're doing in workforce development.
Yes. Any advice as we close to other Black women in general, Black women in leadership, Black women that are executive directors, that are working with youth? What is some advice that you would give to them?
Absolutely. So there's two things that I say to my team every single day, and that's pace and grace. And the first one that I say is pace, because it's important that we pace ourselves. Again, as I mentioned with the open heart surgery, a lot of times we put on our cape and we keep going, and it's not a cape moment. And there's other times that we don't take our cape off, and it is a take off the cape moment. It's a stop and rest and relax. And then I say grace. It's important that we extend grace to others, and it's also important that we extend that same grace to ourselves.
Thank you. Any last takeaways, anything that you want to say before we close that you didn't mention or get to say or highlight?
The only thing that I would say is that there is power in community. And I know that I've, kind of said that a few times throughout the evening, but there's power in community. And, I will hold true to the notion that we are the solution, and that if we use our collective genius and be collective thought partners, we have the power to shift some of the narratives that we see.
Thank you so much, Chrislin, for all of your jewels, your work, and the impact that you are making here in Chicago and in our youth abroad across our city. Thank you for joining us on our podcast today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Yes. And again, thank you all for joining Momentum with Markayle. Please be on the lookout for more upcoming episodes where we will discuss housing, education, and more youth opportunities. Again, keep speaking your truth and embracing the power of your own perspective. See you soon. Peace.